So right after the trip, you stayed in China for more than a year.
Yeah, for a
And
little over a
then,
year.
yeah, and then you moved back to India, where you've been for over 2 years, more than 2 years now. So I think you're the right person to ask this question. You have spent a considerable amount of time in the US, which is largely considered the leading superpower, arguably on the decline now. Not me, guys. This is just what I'm sensing. And you spent time in China, which is considered now the leading superpower in the world and will be for the next couple of decades. And India, which is touted to be down the line, maybe one day, jab achhe din aayenge, one of the superpowers. So you have spent time in all three of them. Were there any factors that stood out to you that showed you why they were where they were? Whether it was the people, the culture, history, international relations. This is something you have done a lot of research in, the politics, form of governance.
Yeah, I think that's an incredible question and one that is not going to have an easy answer. So bear with me while I go in different directions. So one of the things that I feel that has made the US a superpower and that it continues to kind of hold its own in the global stage is this acceptance of what the global order requires at what time. Now that sounds like a really hefty thing to say. What I mean by that is a superpower, in order to maintain its power, often has to curb other emerging powers, right? The US understood this role right from the very beginning at the end of the World War II when it realized that the former powers, the former strongholds in the world, especially in Europe, were not going to take on the mantle of global leadership, didn't have the size, didn't have the population, didn't have the military, didn't have the economy, and had been just crushed by years and years of war. And you had the Soviet Union, which was there. What the US had to do was build a us versus them narrative, which also, to be fair, the Soviet Union was pushing, and had to just build allies around the world. What it did well is build those allies, and it realized the importance of building those allies into a kind of codependency, which would mean that, hey, if someone attacks us, you come with us, or if someone attacks you, we will come and support you. An interdependent world like this works very well into the US hands because it has that size and power and economy to support this kind of structure. And obviously, it works well for them because they make a ton of money. The population, uh, you know, has great incomes and prosperity, etc., etc. Now, once it's realized this and its people are happy with this kind of economic growth, there comes a point after a certain period of growth where once you beat the middle class, which the US did over time, and your people get to a point in which everyone's wealthy and rich, and at that scale the US is a big country, and so after that people start asking questions about freedom, about liberty, about personal dominion over what they want to do. The US is going through that phase right now, where for a lot many years it was on autopilot. A leader would come through. It might be Republican, Democrat. Really doesn't make much of a difference in your life. I mean, I'm sure minorities would disagree, but this was the case for the longest time. But now you're in a world in which the US is not the sole power, and people are asking questions about their liberty, about their freedoms. Why am I discriminated against? And that only happens after a certain point of economic growth, where you can start thinking about these kind of questions. Now, I'm going to pause that for a second and let's visit China for a little bit. The reason China has had such a like basically a behemoth kind of growth, and has lifted people out of poverty like no other country in the world, is because it was previously, at least ever since the Cultural Revolution, a very poor country. And what a homogeneous economic system can do, economic system that applies to everybody, be it an autocratic way or in a democratic way, is that when people realize that your lives are going to drastically improve every day, every month, every year, really at that point when you're making the jump from poverty to middle class or whatever, comfortable class you can call it, is that you're really not questioning your freedoms or your rights or any of that. So now China is in that period of growth that US had experienced all those hundreds of years ago, where their population was just, kind of getting into the middle class. So people are not questioning anything. They're happy with an autocratic government. And that's what I saw. No one, I mean, at least in mainland China, and I say mainland, I'm excluding Tibet, excluding Xinjiang, I'm excluding Taiwan and some of Hong Kong and some of these other places, just for the sake of this argument, is that in the mainland you wouldn't see much dissent, and that's because people are only just realizing what economic prosperity can do for them. Having that ability to improve your lives, improve your parents' lives, having better healthcare, better food, seeing the world, traveling, owning things, materialism, they're in that phase right now. And so when the world says, why aren't people like revolting against an autocratic China? It's like, why would they? Their lives are improving at such an impressive and drastic state. So let's pause that again for a second. Now let's take the case of India. India is in that stage where China was in the 1960s or 70s. At that point, India and China in the 1960s were very similar in terms of GDP and like a bunch of other metrics that looked at economic prosperity. China had this incredible growth. India only opened up in the late 90s, whereas China had a little bit of a head start in the 80s with Deng Xiaoping. Now, when India has started opening up, we did see, people not really question the political, whatever, the license Raj and this and all these corruption that was going on to a certain extent, because incomes were rising a little bit. We were having access to a lot of different things. But that did not rise at a sustained pace like it did in China. In China, it was every year they were experiencing new things and economic prosperity at levels that were unfathomable. In India, unfortunately, a bunch of oligarchs took control of industries or businesses, and certain castes and groups started like accumulating knowledge and accumulating different kinds of economic instruments. And so we haven't seen that kind of economic prosperity happen in India yet. But that said, we have the demographic advantage where we have a very young population that can, push the wheels of the economy to get to a certain point, and that's what the entire, I think the narrative is hinging on, is that India will eventually be able to get their young population to do magic and wonder and all these kind of things. But if that's the idea without an actual plan to lift people out of poverty, to make the society equal, it's really not going to amount to anything. And that's my concern with India right now, and that's what I'm seeing right now in India, is that yeah, we'll be talking about the demographic dividend forever, but unless we did what China did, and I'm not, supporting what China did at all I'm saying is that whatever whatever measure was taken in China, it applied to at least a majority of the population, and that suppressed dissent to a certain degree. Now, people are going to say that India is a democracy, and so things are slow. Agreed, 100%. But there's no plan, and if there is no plan, it only sets us back. So now we're placed in this world in which you have China rising, you have US under terrible leadership kind of succumbing its power and giving away control of some of the places that it previously dominated, including international organizations. So it's this interesting, kind of situation that's emerging globally, where you have this new power that's emerging that the world is really skeptical about. You have this former power that's making decisions that really don't support its own need to be in power, and you have other upcoming powers also sabotaging themselves by putting its own citizens down and not allowing citizens to grow. And that's a whole another discussion in itself, because you have India being broken into so many different parts, whereas the dominant power only wants certain groups of people to get to a certain level of comfort and prosperity. It's a recipe for disaster, and unfortunately that's the situation we're in.